Hey guys, welcome and thank you for joining our special roundtable webinar today for experts weigh in on GDPR, identity and access controls as an enabler. My name is Sarah, your webinar host today. I just want to run through a couple housekeeping items first. A reminder that all attendee lines are muted, but in an effort to keep the session interactive, we invite you to submit your questions live through the GoToMeeting console. And if we have time left at the end, we will jump into live Q&A. Also, today's session is being recorded. You'll receive a follow-up email containing links to the recording and the slides shown here today within 1 to 2 business days from now. The slides can also be immediately downloaded via the handout section in the GoToWebinar console. You'll find that on the side of your screen. Additionally, we offer CPE credits through ISACA. If you are attending for CPE credits and have an ISACA account, you must download the attendance verification document in the handout section now in order to submit proof that you attended today's session. And please note that you are responsible for reporting your CPE hours earned to ISACA. So let me just take a moment to walk you all through who will be speaking and then how the panelist discussion is going to work today. So we have 4 panelists live here today. Let me go ahead and move into our second screen so you can see everybody's beautiful face. First speaking will be Steve Wright, who is the Data Privacy and InfoSec Officer over at John Lewis Partnership. Second to speak will be Anthony Mornay, who is Founder and Managing Director at IAM Experts. Then Martin Whitby, who is SailPoint Senior Evangelist. And finally, Scott Lang, he's Senior Director of PAM Product Marketing here at Beyond Trust. We'll wrap up the slides and then we'll dive into some audience questions. So our panelists will speak individually to a couple of slides for the first 30 minutes or so, and then the last 30 minutes will feature questions that were submitted by registrants leading up to today's live show. So we're super excited to cover your guys' questions. Each question will be featured on a slide and then the experts will discuss. Okay, cool. So now that that's all out of the way, let's waste no more time and hand this on over to our first panelist, Steve Wright, who's going to jump right in. Welcome to the line, Steve, and take it away.
Thank you very much.
You're
delighted
welcome.
to be here. And I was looking forward to this. So thank you for this opportunity to speak and share some of the highlights of GDPR for John Lewis Partnership. I'm just going to spend the next 10 to 15 minutes talking about what we've done here at John Lewis and how we try to take it away from just a tick box exercise to make it much more about the culture and embedding it into operational. Next slide, please. So the first thing that we did was look at how this GDPR could be applied. And if you look at Articles 5 and 6, it talks all about accountability. And what does that mean? That means that somebody somewhere needs to take that responsibility for the data. And so we set about getting our board, several members of the board, to each take accountability for their respective data sets. So as you can see here from the diagram, we set about getting the customer, director, the partner, that's our staff, that's what we're called here at John Lewis, supplier and finance, and pensions. So each of them then had a set of responsibilities. And of course, the first question that they asked me was, great, Steve, you know, now you've told me that I'm on the hook for GDPR, how do I go about doing this? And I said, well, okay, let's first of all work out the governance or the structure around how we're going to manage data so that we understand across 85,000 staff, 400 shops, exactly where our data is at any time, and that you can answer the questions that may be put to you either by a regulator or by a customer or by a member of staff about what data we hold about them and where that data is and who has access to that data. So we set about answering those questions, and we set the governance in place so that we had divisional line management responsibility and directors, that we had work stream owners to ensure that the rights of those individuals were upheld, and that we also employed a new term that was new to the partnership called data stewards. And these people were very much sort of working in the layer between, if you like, the business and almost custodians of the data. So they were sort of like data brokers, if you like. And we've set them up in both our divisions, which is both grocery and our online environment, which trades about £4.5 billion online. And of course, our shops around the country, which are sort of haberdashery to, buying a TV and a washing machine sort of thing. And the big part of this was to enable that was all about changing hearts and minds. Next slide, please. So what we did here was we thought, okay, long and hard, typically you would put out e-learning, typically you'd send out a few posters and, just ask and expect. But we wanted to do it differently. We knew that we had this deadline, and we knew that we needed to ensure that if any one of our customers or our staff asked the question to their line manager or to anyone in the business, that they could, with reasonable ways, answer the question. And their questions naturally were about, well, what data do you hold about me? What can I do? What am I allowed? Am I allowed the right to be forgotten? Or, can I take that data in form of a subject access request? So we had to set up all of those back-end processes and implement them across our divisions and across our functions. That took a huge amount of work in terms of the discovery of understanding where the data was, in terms of understanding the processes that delivered that, and then understanding who the data owners were in each of those applications and those systems and those processes. But more importantly, we wanted to understand where that data and how that data was being used on the shop floor. So we set about really propagating the message, and we set up podcasts, we did videos, we did training exercises, we ran road shows. Importantly, we set up a network of 200 champions up and down the country that were sort of more trained individuals so that they could answer some of those questions, almost be ambassadors for us. And of course, we set up a hub at the very heart. So all the frequently asked questions, the policies, the standards, and the instructions, the work instructions, were all readily accessible. We even ran competitions. In our, we have, as you imagine, distribution centres, we have garages, we have factories, we have all of this. So we also printed material that sat on the desks in the cafeterias and in the breakout areas, so that people could sit there whilst having a cup of tea and read and understand about what rights meant. Next slide, please. And how do we do this? Well, we started very early on by formulating this house diagram that you can see here. This was key because the trouble with 99 articles and similar amount of recitals and all of the guidance coming out of the various different regulators, ICO, CNIL, the Dutch, the Germans, it was very confusing for our businesses and our legal departments and our IT to understand how this is applicable. So we built this framework and we structured it in such a way, as you can see there, that the governance sat over the top, but the important thing was that foundation stones, that accountability that run throughout the business so that any individual could effectively answer the question about who, what, why, where, when. But if they didn't know, that they knew where to go to answer that question or where to point the customer to. Key to all of this was risk. And we've embedded some real key risk assessment processes which were fundamental to the success of GDPR and to changing the culture. And you can see an example of that risk assessment process on the right. So every time a new change, every time a new project is initiated, we ask our project managers and our change agents to actually fill out one of these self-assessment questionnaires. Now that's particularly important because what we didn't want to do is we didn't want to become a blocker to being able to understand the risk that's been associated by what they wanted to do with the data. Whether it was a marketing campaign, whether it was a new competition that they were running between the branches, whatever it was, wherever it was, whatever type of use of the data, we wanted to know about it. So we had to make that self-fulfilling. And this is essentially what we've built in. We also set about working closely with our IT colleagues on some of those key components under security. So things like access control, privileged access management, knowing that the right people have access to the right time, and then alerting us when people were out of hours or there was suspicious activity. Knowing that data loss prevention software was at the various egress points. And also making sure just basic encryption was there for the data at rest and data in transit. And then equally importantly, and especially if you look at some of the breaches and incidents that we see, being able to delete the data and ensure that we're in complying with the retention schedules and the accuracy or the integrity of that data was equally critical. But by far the biggest and single thing there was making sure that the right people had access to the right data at the right time in the right format, and not for prolonged periods of time, not for indefinite access, but actually very restricted. Next slide, please. So the key to all of this was making sure that I took the board and our audit and risk committees on a journey with us. And that I can tell you, I've got scars to prove it. That was hard work. But actually what we did very early on was we set out some of the key performance indicators across those different domains, as you can see there, 1 to 12. And we started to set realistic achievement goals that could be measured against so that we could report progress. And so that the people who only had a limited time to look at this could understand and get a level of assurance that GDPR was being properly addressed and implemented, and that we had the respective policies and procedures and the back-end stuff like incident management and breach handling all in place, all operational, including things like our SOC, including how we then protected those assets, those critical assets going forward from threats that we're not aware of. And we started to build the dashboard, and you can just see in the backdrops there, so that you can just see that we, in terms of the number of data protection impact assessments run into the hundreds, the number of information security assessments, and importantly, our third parties. We recognize, looking at the breach history, that our third parties was a key Achilles heel to most organizations. So knowing the threat profile, knowing the risks that are associated with data sharing, where that data was going to, who had access to that data, was really critical for us. And the other thing we did was we set about making sure that we got surveys running. And we tried out in branches and back at head office to find out what the level of understanding was. So we kept on testing it to make sure that we could take those key learnings and improve where necessary. We didn't get it right all the time. We had to change messages for truck drivers. We had to change managers for part-time staff who only worked on a Saturday. But eventually we got there. Next slide, please. So before I hand over to Anthony, I'll just sort of summarize. In essence, it was complete culture change for this business to suddenly be held accountable and to understand why, what, who, where, and when that data was being used, how it was being used, why it was being used. And over the last 2.5 years, we've set in place all of the structure, the plumbing, if you like, the infrastructure that's required to make sure that going forward, we know exactly what that is. We now know where our legacy data is, how long we've got it for, when it's due for renewal or for deletion, etc. And we can give that assurance back up to our stakeholders and to our business partners that we've got this in control. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Anthony, who's going to talk to you from Identity and Access Management Experts. Over to you, Anthony.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you very much. That was great to hear that from you, and a great overview of what you've achieved. Great feedback. Thank you. So as a matter of introduction, so I'm Anthony Morley. I'm the director of IM Experts. We are a consultancy, and you can guess where we focus in identity and access management. And I wanted, without overlapping with what Steve has mentioned, just to give a feedback on what we face talking to many different organizations in many industries over the last 12 months, really. Give some ideas on our approach, where what we've seen, the big misunderstandings sometimes around GDPR, and a few tips how to progress and how to approach that if you are at the beginning of your journey. Because one thing we've seen is there's a big differences from one organization to another or where you are. So the first, where I would start is, and what you see here is an overview of our methodology. But one of the first points sometimes is to identify what's the goal and what you're trying to achieve. And one thing to make it clear, the goal is not to prevent 100% breach on data, because unfortunately that's impossible. You might want to mitigate that risk, but you can never be 100% sure that you're going to prevent a breach. What you're trying to achieve is often to demonstrate accountability, and Steve talk about accountability. You want to be in a position that if somebody asks questions, whether it's one of your customers, your employees, or the regulators, you want to be in a position that you can demonstrate that you've done the right things and you've got the right controls in place. So how do you do that? Well, first of all, and also I'm going to reuse one of the great things you've said, Steve, is you've got to start somewhere and accept that you're not going to get it right from the very beginning, but you will improve step by step. And one of the great things to do that is to be able to measure that. And the key performance indicators, the KPI shown by Steve a minute ago, are just the right way to progress and step by step. Now, in terms of the approach, because GDPR is very wide topics, and you can be lost between consent management, what you're allowed to do from a digital marketing perspective, for example, the protection of data. Well, really, it's confusing, and it's touching a lot of different departments and within the organizations, which is why I personally find it fascinating. But it's a source of complexity. So the way we approach it is usually what we call the 3 lines of defense between the business process, where you've got to adapt your existing business processes to deal with the new controls, the new regulations. We talk about consent management, for example. That's an important part, and that's often where we suggest to start with, to bring the awareness and start reviewing your business processes. The second one is the second line of defense is around training and awareness. And Steve has mentioned that training and awareness is a great, very important point. You've got, it depends on the size of your organizations, but without going to an extreme, there are simple things that can be done with e-learning systems where you can make sure that your employees, for example, within your organizations are aware of what GDPR is, what it means. But you can also demonstrate that they understand it by just validating their awareness at the end of the e-learning with a questionnaire. That's very common things in highly regulated industries like financial services, but that's something to be reused and a good way to act. And the last one is probably the widest, is data protection. So we talk about access control, where I like sometimes to take the example of working backwards. If you go to the ICO website in the UK, if you're in the UK, which is the regulator, and look at, actually, regardless of where you are, go to the regulator website, your regulator website, and look at the data breach form, which is what you have to fill in case of a breach. And the question you need to ask yourself is, am I able to answer these questions tomorrow if that happens? Then you can identify where you're probably a little bit weak and where you need to invest some time. But that's a good advice and usually a good way to move forward step by step. I've just finished on that point, saying in terms of data protections, which is definitely an important part to consider. Think about, before being able to control the data, the first part is to be able to identify where my data is, and the data flows everywhere. Identify where it is, classify the data, and you can get some help from great products such as SailPoint and Beyond Trust. and controlling this data. When you know where it is and when you know what kind of data you're dealing with, then you can apply the right controls, such as reducing or the level of access for each type of data. I will hand over. I will close this part, and I will hand over to Martin for the SailPoint part.
Thank you, Anthony. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Martin Whitby, and I'm talking to you from SailPoint. SailPoint is one of the market leaders from identity governance and administration, with a number of the different analysts. And really, I wanted to talk this afternoon about the importance of identity governance and really the fact that in order to provide those controls, those access controls that Anthony was just talking about and that Steve has also cited during his section, you really need to actually understand the identities that you have within your organization. For a long time, organizations have used firewalls and the perimeter of the organization as their primary security point. With the advent of the cloud environments that so many organizations are using and SaaS-based services, we're finding increasingly that perimeter is increasingly porous. A lot of your information is being held outside in SaaS-based solutions, and really that means that the identity has now become the center of your security model. The identity has become your perimeter. So actually, you need to enforce the controls at an identity level. You need to actually manage identities and manage the access that they have, so that you're controlling the access to sensitive data, to data that falls within the classifications of GDPR. As Anthony said, once you've classified that information, then you need to actually use identity and identity information to actually restrict the access that your users have. So your users are going to have a level of access. That's a given in terms of the fact that you need that data, which you have to justify as part of the GDPR. You need that data, it has a purpose, therefore your identities are going to require access. And really what SailPoint are espousing and backing up is this concept that identity actually reaches out further than just your identity governance platform. We're talking about endpoint management and providing identity context into the endpoint management, so that at the endpoint management layer, your users only get access to appropriate applications and appropriate data. We're feeding information into the scenes. When Anthony was talking about data breaches earlier and the fact that you need to be able to report data breaches, actually passing security information, just having security events within your SIEM system, security information and event management system, and the accounts that they relate to, isn't actually enough for you to understand the identity context. So actually feeding identity information into that SIEM system, that security information and event management system, allows you to get more insight into the identity context of that security event. And it starts to give you information that enriches that security event, like the user's department, where they're based, what time zone they're in, so that you can actually assess the actions and the behaviors of those users. And similarly, looking at user behavior analytics and actually feeding that information into those systems. Using identity information to make decisions about mobility management. So what mobile devices a user can use should be based on their identity, not just the account that they have. And really, SailPoint has opened up this market and the IT systems, and is offering out that information where appropriate. So we're actually providing the ability for organizations to retrieve identity-based information, so that you can heighten the controls and the responses that those systems have and the systems that they make. So taking access management as another example, where you're using a single sign-on solution to give your end users access. Single sign-on is a wonderful tool for end user capabilities, end user performance, end user satisfaction, but fundamentally it doesn't necessarily provide security unless you're reviewing the applications that a user gets access to through that access management system. But these things work in both directions. So when we talk about identity governance, we're really talking about visibility and control. So visibility of what a user's got access to and the ability to control it. Because obviously, just having visibility without control, you can't make changes to that user's access. So you can't reduce the privilege that user has to the least required privilege, which again is not only best practice, but is implied within GDPR. So we're also taking feeds in from systems, particularly privileged account management systems like Beyond Trust. We're taking information in and using that information to add to the existing view that we have of the user's access, because the user's access isn't just their day-to-day account that has access. We need that information as part of a governance decision, but we also need to see the information about what access they have from a privilege perspective. So we're integrating with privilege management systems like Beyond Trust to pull in that privileged information, and therefore to increase the information that we have about the identity, and using that to make decisions about whether it's still appropriate, and then removing it if it's unnecessary, to really make sure that your users only have the access to the critical data that they need to do their jobs. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Scott from Beyond Trust.
Hey, thanks very much, Martin. Hi, everybody. My name is Scott Lang, work for Beyond Trust. Beyond Trust specializes in helping customers control their user privileges and passwords so they can't be used inappropriately or in a data breach. So let's talk very quickly about how Privileged Access Management, or PAM, helps out from a GDPR perspective. And really, I think the fundamental principle here is not just controlling who, but what has access to the systems that house your sensitive data, including the PII. From my perspective, I think Privileged Access Management has a couple of important, I don't want to say capabilities, but some considerations that have to be made in the context of protecting access to PII. This first is the concept of what I'll call discovery, and that is being able to find all of the users in your organization that might have elevated rights and access to systems they shouldn't, more privileges than they should, as well as the privileged accounts that are gateways to the systems that house that data, right? So finding it, being able to control, who can access what, control those privileges, putting them in containers that, help them manage those privileges and those rights. A second important consideration from a privilege perspective is, scanning for vulnerabilities and configuration compliance problems in the systems that are housing those critical devices. Even though there isn't any express control communicated in GDPR for some of this technology, I think it's still important to note that this is all kind of integrated, right? So you're controlling access to the systems and the applications and databases that house PII, as well as being able to monitor their health and being able to report on that on an ongoing basis. So finding all the accounts, putting them under control, helping you to scan for potential security problems on the systems that house that data, eliminating shared accounts, embedded accounts, and application accounts rather with access to data is another important control implied in privileged access management with regard to GDPR. Basically disallowing any system you don't want to have access or a person you don't want to have access to those systems by implementing a disciplined workflow process to say you have to check out access and monitor that and audit that along the way. All of this really rolls up to this concept of least privilege, right? This is not new. We've been talking about least privilege for years. You've been implementing least privilege. But enforcing that privilege and elevating access to particular applications by exception is, I think, an important consideration to make when deciding who can have access and what actions and commands that they can perform on those target systems and devices once you allow it. Now, all of those things I would probably put in the category of proactive controls, right? The discovery, the scanning, the shared account, embedded account, application account management, enforcing least privilege and elevating access by exception, all proactive controls, right? So that's only half of the equation. The second half of the equation I would consider as, of course, reactive controls. And this is the ongoing monitoring of user activity, logging, session recording of actions and activity while privileged accounts are signed out, or while a privileged user is accessing a particular database or system. And I think that balance between proactive and reactive controls is the right one to take from a privilege perspective. again, at the end of the day, it's all about applying layers of control over who has access to systems, whether it's a standard user that's maybe governed through an identity management platform, or a privileged user that's managed through a privileged account management platform. Another consideration to make is, how well these systems are integrated so that you have, a single view into the rights and privileges of all your users, whether they're, privileged or standard users, and how they map into the security ecosystem. And the last thing you want is another tool. So having a system that helps to address multiple different use cases with a single deployment is key. So again, from a PAM perspective, my point of view, Beyond Trust point of view, is that it's a balance between proactive and reactive controls. That's not just controlling the accounts and the users, but also monitoring all of the activity on those accounts and users on the back end, which can then help you prove compliance, or at least prove that if violations ended up happening, that you have the right steps in place to mitigate those issues from happening again. All right. Again, pretty simplified, but definitely my view and our view of PAM as it relates to GDPR. All right. Many of you had submitted questions ahead of time, and we've got a couple of questions also sitting in the queue as well for this webinar. So I wanted to pivot over at this time and start to maybe talk about some of those questions. The first one up came from Vikram. Vikram asks, what do I need to be concerned about as a DPO for the EU GDPR compliance? And to start out with an answer, why don't we go to Steve?
Great, thank you. So I think the most important thing, as I mentioned before, was that you have accountability, that people in your organization know what data they have, where that data is, how long or how old the data is, and what you're trying to do with the data. That's called the legal, the purposes or the legal grounds for processing that data. I think as a DPO, wherever you are, if you're handling, if your organization is handling data subjects or PII in the EU or EU systems, data subjects as they're called, then you need to be absolutely sure that you know where that data is, who has access to it, as I mentioned, but also what are the legal grounds for you processing that data. And that should be contained in your records of processing, which is Article 30 of the GDPR. And I would say that is absolute, the number one thing. Now, that sounds easy, but obviously that means data mapping. That needs understanding where the application sits, where the data sits, how it traverses the networks and the systems. So it's not I'm making it sound easy, but to answer the question, what do I need to be concerned about as a DPO for compliance sake is basically what is the status, where is my data, who has access to it, how long I'm retaining data. So you need to be able to answer those 5 W's, as I often said to my leadership team, and that will put you in a really strong footing. And then what grounds do you have for processing that data? So accountability, certainly under sort of Articles 5 and 6, as I said, and that sort of lawfulness of processing that data. So what basis is it? Consent? Is it legitimate interest in terms of, is it a service or a contract? So you've got to be able to understand that, and you've got to have been able to have demonstrate that to a regulator that you've looked at it, you've assessed it, and that you understand what controls are in place or how you're maintaining the rights and freedoms of that individual at the same time as, delivering a service or providing information to your business or providing your business to be able to communicate with that individual. Sorry, slightly long-winded, but it's not any, that's the premise, is that accountability and the legal grounds for processing. There's a lot more, but I won't go into. I'm sure there's other questions.
I'm sure. Steve, that's great. Martin, how about you? What thoughts might you have on this?
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, so I think part of the challenge for every organisation is that organisations don't remain static. So, as Steve said, you need to understand the data, you need to understand the access that people have got to it. But this isn't a static picture. So, as your organisation evolves and changes, you need to continue to actually ensure that the right levels of access are there, and also to watch out for entitlement creep, really. So users moving through an organisation and moving from maybe from the shop floor where they've got one level of access, to put it in the context of John Lewis, maybe moving into a management role and then to HQ. What level of access do they have as they move through the organisation, and really making sure that you actually maintain that and manage that appropriately, because this isn't, as I say, it's not a static one-time activity. You do need to continue to manage and process that fundamentally. So actually understanding how your organisation is changing and what the access changes for your users are as they move through the organisation is also key. So it's kind of really Steve covered off the very first steps, but actually it is an ongoing process, as is the data discovery and classification. That continues to be an ongoing process as more and more data is created by users in the normal function of their job, and quite rightly.
Yeah, very true there, Martin. And I think maybe from a privilege perspective, just the one minor corollary onto that would be just the ongoing, auditing and movement of, privileged users over time, and making sure that reporting, that auditing, all of that data is presented in such a way that, the DPO and others in the organization can easily digest it, take action on it, and then, make whatever decisions they need to make as far as, reactive or forensic controls on the other end. All right, let's take a look at the next question we have that's come in from Alan. For global organizations that use centralized controls, which may not be hosted within Europe, which may contain personal data, for example, employee information stored by HR, what considerations or obligations do we need to consider under GDPR? Again, I think I'll start with Steve for this one.
Yeah, thank you. This is again, it's a complicated question, or certainly a complicated answer, but I'll try my best. So if the trouble is, it depends on the data. If the data is about European citizens, data subjects, then you're still liable, or your organisation still falls under the requirements of GDPR. So that's why this is such a far-reaching piece of regulation. Not only is it 500 million people that make up the European continent, but it's actually all of those organisations that, if you think about anything like Gmail or Google, just generally speaking, traditionally hosted in the US-based companies, they may actually servers may be processing that data on European citizens, but might be in Arizona, Texas, right? So the challenge is understanding, going back to that mapping, and understanding where that data flows from and flows to. Now, between depending where you are in the world, there are 120 countries with privacy laws, sometimes written into the Constitution, and then obviously we've got organizations like, countries like South America and Brazil that have just passed law. We've got Singapore, and of course, most recently, the California privacy law, which is also based on GDPR. So this sort of contagion effect is happening around the world, on top of the 120 different countries that have laws or rules around personal data or privacy. And then in terms of the considerations, like Russia, for example, has very strict rules about taking data out of, especially HR data is a classic example of taking data outside or processing that data outside of the Russian Federation. So similar with China, there are certainly different rules, and that's why it's a complex answer, I think, but it goes back to that fundamental principle of knowing where your data is. There are things like binding corporate rules, which is a legal framework in which you can exchange data. There's obviously the Privacy Shield, which was before that was Safe Harbor, but that's been disputed by the European Commission as to what's adequate. There are other countries which have or recognise adequacy, so that those countries can interchange data between them. These are all rules that you need to be advised about from your lawyer, from your legal team, but most importantly, this is understanding once again where that data is, and where it's traversing, even in that journey. And that's why it's so important to map where that data goes, because sometimes, those backup services can be in a different country, in a different, different location. And so you need to understand that.
Terrific, Steve. Great question, Alan. Good answer, Steve. Maybe move on to the next question here. Should global organizations take a differentiated, for example, different data handling per region, or all as one approach to managing their global population's personal data? Again, I think this is a good one for Steve to start out with.
Yeah, I think this is again. I'm sorry if I'm sounding a bit vague, but it is definitely horses for courses, or it depends. In fact, I'm starting to sound like a lawyer. It depends. You can't have. I don't believe there's a one-size-fits-all approach to this. You can have your framework. And when I was at Unilever, I was the chief privacy officer, and we built the framework to run and operate across 150 odd countries. And that framework is still in operation, so I'm told. So really, if you think about the principles of privacy, if you think about what it is you're trying to protect, the rights and freedoms of individuals, you're trying to enable the business to leverage that data and really utilize that data, but within the constraints of law, so you don't overstep the mark. So if you can set those principles in your policies and in your notices in terms of transparency, then you can sort of have a bit of a one-size-fits-all. And I think that commonality is being being pushed by governments around the world who are also adopting GDPR as the sort of de facto standard. In Asia Pacific, that's very much catching a light across that region. So we are finding commonality between what rule sets that we all feel, or codes of conduct and ways of working that I feel that you can apply across the globe. But again, going back to my earlier point about culture, it is a journey. No one could be expected to be there overnight. It takes time to change the minds and the attitudes and the behaviours of individuals, of what they do with the data and how they email the data, or they drop the data via FTP or whatever they do, and how that traverses that network or system to system. And to answer your question, there are different slight nuances of the rules, but the principles are very similar around the world.
Yeah, very good, and super clear on the answer there. I think that definitely makes sense. The next one feels like a question for Anthony. Anthony, Liz asks, what are organizations' most common mistake and misunderstanding about GDPR?
Hi, thank you, Scott. That's a good question. So I would say the first answer that comes into mind is, and I don't know exactly why, but we often face organizations that think they need consent for everything. And they need consent to send every single email outside the organizations. And there is a worry and another worry sometimes about where consent management is required. That's something we see very, very often. There is always a need for education and clarifications around that. The other one, and if I stick to mainly two, and that would be good to hear from you, Steve, as well, on when you started the journey, what was the misunderstanding. But the other one that we face very often is, at least in the UK, where with the DPA replaced by GDPR, was covered a lot by updating your security policies, having well documented procedures. Organizations didn't have to demonstrate accountability and controls in the same way they have, and to the same level of granularity they have to do it within GDPR. And that is often something which is overlooked. They don't realize about the obligations on that side and how data should be protected properly. There is always, as I mentioned before, a bit of business processes that need to be covered, but as well as really operating controls and cybersecurity controls with solutions like SailPoint and Beyond Trust and many others. Steve, what's your, maybe if you have an input on that one on your side, what have you seen as the common mistakes on your side?
Yeah, I think a lot of okay, so this is slightly contentious, but I think a lot of organizations maybe perhaps more so in the past have approached the problem as a legal problem. And for me, as a sort of cybersecurity and data governance and privacy expert, I don't think it's that alone. I think it has to be, there's a bit of a theme emerging here. It's about the data, and it's about what value can be extracted from that data, but at the same time being responsible and respecting, the rights of individuals. So I think what I've seen in a number of my peers is that they've tried to operate this within the constraints of a legal framework, and that's very hard if you don't take it from a sort of perspective of being, how are we going to operate this? How are we going to maintain this, and what's going to be the method, if you like, of implementing it? I think that's one point. The second common mistake or misunderstanding is that this is a program. Lots of organizations may have done parts of it, but this is an ongoing thing. I'm not sure whether it was Anthony or Martin, but said, this is just part of understanding the life cycle of data, and then making sure that those controls get triggered or put in place when and where appropriate. And I think that's why, for me, my recommendation is definitely you need a privacy lawyer on your team or a good law firm. But actually, a lot of this is really getting under the covers of data. So data analysts, privacy professionals, security professionals, like the guests we have on today, identity and access management. So it is multi-skilled approach that's needed to tackle GDPR, because it's so wide-ranging. It's not just about the confidentiality and integrity and availability from a security. It's about making sure that those rights are in place, that you can answer and address a subject access request or a right to be forgotten within 30 days. There are all these components that are very process orientated. And so my advice, if anything, if you're building it or if you're improving it, I don't think there's a silver bullet out there in terms of software as well. I've seen a lot of organizations go, oh, we've done this and we've captured this and this, but there's so much more. And I think the culture piece is a big part as well.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Steve, and provides a really clean transition here to the next question that Timothy asks. And again, we'll start with Anthony. You talked about legal's involvement. You talked about other departments in the organization, the privacy group, and more. But let's maybe ask the question about technology. Is the process part is important, the people part is important, but let's talk about specific technologies. Is technology really essential? And what are some of those technologies that are essential in making GDPR happen?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So again, there is no one solution fits all. it really depends on the size of the organizations and the amount of data, really, more than the size of the organization. But we always have two steps approach on that side. The first one is you probably can improve a lot of controls with what you already have. Basic controls, cybersecurity controls are often completely overlooked. And if you're in the UK, you look at the cybersecurity essentials, very basic, but it covers already for small and medium organizations really good advices on what you should cover. And then the second step, because the first step is very often quite fast to cover. The second one is, all right, now look at the amount of data and the controls that you need to put in place. And for controls like identifying where your data is, classifying the data, it's often impossible or extremely tedious to cover that manually. That's where the technology is, to provide some automations on the first step. And the second point where technology is extremely useful, and the example of SailPoint and Beyond Trust, is on the analytical skills that it will provide to identify where you may have some irregularities, inconsistencies in your data, and you should focus because you cannot have someone in every corner watching the data 24/7. And that's where the technology will be extremely useful, especially in these days with artificial intelligence.
Speaking of technology and the intersection of technology, processes, and people, let's talk about something that was mentioned a little while ago, I think in Steve's part of the presentation, about culture. You know, in the UK, Sam wants to know, have we seen a lot of changes since May 25th of 2018? You know, I'm talking about it from an entire landscape, maybe culturally, organizationally, legally, more. You know, Anthony, what's your perspective on that?
I'm tempted to say no sometimes, because don't get me wrong, I see a lot of things happening, a lot of program, sometimes project, unfortunately, but programs being initiated in GDPR, even now, just now. But at the same time, we see a lot of organizations behaving the same way. And it's like a divided world between organizations that are proactively to that topic very seriously and been acting on it, and other organizations which are waiting to see if it's going to burn, if it's going to be painful. I think it's still a bit early. That's my own opinion as an expert, to be honest. And I'm really, really interested to see how that's going to go in the next couple of months, really. It's done very much so to the regulator in each country and how much they're going to enforce it, because it's a huge task. They're facing a huge mountains. The ICO in the UK have a lot of they've hired a lot of people in that area, but yes, the next couple of months are going to be very, very interesting to watch in that space.
Very good. Next question up, Kelly asks, how does PAM help me in protecting PII, or where do I start in building my GDPR compliant cybersecurity strategy? So that might be one I can kind of jump in and help out with here. You know, if you think back to what we talked about a little while ago during the main part of our presentation, in my slide specifically, is, you know, think of it again from the structure of proactive versus reactive controls. You know, PAM is definitely a foundational element of addressing the requirements of any compliance regime or any cybersecurity framework. You know, ensuring that you know, privileged user access is controlled, that their activity is audited and monitored throughout the, you know, life cycle of their activity, and that you have the capacity to, you know, prove that users and accounts were behaving the way they should, and if they weren't, you have a plan to mitigate that going forward to avoid any particular compliance problems, you know, in the future. You know, focus primarily on building permissions from the ground up. We're starting with a standard user account and only really giving access to resources that they actually need to be productive in their role. We talked about logging as well a few moments ago, and logging what's happening while the limited privilege is being used, or even recording keystrokes, mouse clicks, and display activities, session recording. You really have a comprehensive auditing of legitimate access and really no unauthorized access opportunity at that point. Again, it's just, all about not just the privileged accounts that could be shared or embedded that, provide access or the keys into the underlying databases, the application servers, or the applications themselves where data is housed, but ensuring that the users that interact with those privileged accounts and the rest of the users in the organization, are adherents to the fundamental least privilege. This is a tripartite responsibility, right? IT has responsibility to, manage and ensure users have the access they need. Security and audit needs to ensure that the proactive controls are in place that IT is implementing. And then, as always, management and the board need to have visibility into, what potential violations might have happened over a period of time, so that they can, put the right controls in place to prevent that from happening again. So again, PAM, how it helps with PII, is all about protecting access through shared accounts, privileged accounts, as well as the individual users that are interacting with those systems as well that might have elevated rights. Next question up, what technologies does GDPR require me to have, and how can I prove that I'm compliant? I think Anthony answered this question pretty well a few minutes ago. But again, this all comes down to proactive, reactive controls, preventing access to PII with access by exception, reactive controls, recording, logging, auditing actions, allows you to be preventive and to report on all access, even potential self-reporting on violations to mitigate possible fines. So, and I won't wade too far into that much more, but you'd like to hear from Martin on the topic as well. Martin, what are your thoughts on technologies that GDPR might require?
I think as far as a technology is concerned, or lists of technologies, GDPR doesn't actually specify any. So there's no specific requirements to have technology. That really, it's as has already been mentioned, there's a balance to be had between the technologies that enable you to actually meet GDPR, and then there's also the business processes and the changes in culture that Steve was talking about at the beginning of the session. And it's really, actually, technology is just an enabler. There's no requirement within GDPR for specific technologies, but technologies help with a lot of the requirements, a lot of the articles within GDPR, and actually giving you visibility and actually the understanding of the access that people have to that sensitive data is really key. And if you can't prove to the Data Protection Authority that you are minimizing people's access to that, then that fundamentally is going to be a problem for you in terms of proving your compliance. So I think, in short, that there is no requirement for technology specifically within the regulation, but it is a fact of life that in any organization above a handful of employees and users, you're going to need technology to help you, A, find that data, B, classify it, and C, control access to it fundamentally.
Yeah, terrific and true. Yeah, it's different than some compliance regimes that are very prescriptive on what technologies to implement, what solutions to have, maybe not individual vendor solutions, of course, but specific capabilities versus just broad stroke interpretive controls more than anything else. That's great, guys. Thank you for your insights there in our poll. We're getting near the top of the hour. So I'm going to pitch it back over to Sarah, our host for the day, and Sarah's going to pick up our audience quick poll.
Cool. Thanks, Scott. Okay, guys, let's just jump right into our quick poll. You should see that up on your screen right now. If you are currently assessing your level of compliance with GDPR or want to learn more about how identity governance can help you meet GDPR requirements, please select to be contacted and receive a personalized demo with either SailPoint or Beyond Trust. We'd love to talk to you guys about everything GDPR. So I'm going to just leave this up for just another few moments. I want to be cognizant of everybody's time. And I've got one more slide that I want to show you guys We've got the Twitter handles and other ways that you can contact our experts today. So if you have other questions or conversations you'd like to have with our experts, I will be sharing their contact info with you. And then I'll also let you guys know that a reminder, you will receive a follow-up email containing links to the recording and the slides shown here today within 1 to 2 business days from now. You can also download the slides via the handout section immediately right now. You'll find that PDF there. And also, if you're reporting CPE credits to ISACA, please download the attendance verification document now. Again, you can find that in the handout section. Okay, I'm closing the poll. I know it was up really quick, but if you want to be contacted, please select something right now. And I'm closing it. Okay, and then let's go to this last slide. Again, if you want to connect with the experts, take down their information, follow them on Twitter. They'd love to say hi. Again, you will have access to this document, so you can refer to their contact information at a later time if you don't have enough time to write this down. Hey guys, thank you so much. Steve, Anthony, Martin, Scott, thank you guys so much for being here today. We really appreciate your time, your insight. I think our audience gained a ton of knowledge from you guys sharing from your experiences and the things you're seeing right now on GDPR. So thank you all so much. All right, guys, let's go ahead and we're going to wrap this up. Again, thank you again for attending. Recording and slides will be emailed within 1 to 2 business days from now. We will see you at our next webinar. Take care, everybody, and goodbye.